Usually these are pretty easy to work with. This one, for whatever reason, has been a little bit stubborn. I don't know why. It won't download to my Google Drive, and it won't let me edit it, and it won't. It's just kind of crazy, so I have to fool with it a little bit. I'll have it hopefully sorted out next week or so and have it back up here for you. Satan, right? Satan don't want to let me use it. That's what it is. To be technologically literate, too, is probably more so. Judges chapter 2. We're going to start in verse number 6 today, and we're going to jump into our third lesson here, our second narrative, or second prologue, I guess, that we're going to look at through chapter 2 and a little bit into chapter 3 as well. And we're going to begin to see, of course, last lesson 2 weeks ago started to see the decline, right, of Israel's serving of God. We're going to continue to see that decline, and what was kind of a gradual downhill slope is just going to plummet off a cliff, right? Essentially kind of what's going to happen here with the Israelites in the complete abandonment, essentially, that they go through here when they completely forsake God for a while. And the topic that we're going to see is the jealousy of God. All right, that's kind of what we're going to be looking at as you look through the couple of things that we have. God commands Israel here in chapter 2 to teach the new generation about Him, so that they can learn how to and that they may walk in His ways. There's a commandment here for them to do that. So that's the kind of second prologue here. It develops the idea or the covenant or the commitment that God has to Israel, even in the midst of unfaithfulness. And we see that God's commitment to Israel is seen in His anger that He displays because of their disobedience. And He has this desire to have a completely exclusive relationship with Israel. Just them and Him, right? And He is determined, as we'll see through chapter 2, to woo Israel back to Himself, and He does so through confrontation. He does so through discipline, right? And we've talked about this extensively in 1 Peter, as we just finished up our last lesson, but God puts us through things correctively or to purify us in ways while we're not necessarily doing things wrong, but we get trials of purification to just make us better at serving God. But the other type of thing was trials or confrontations because of disobedience. Those corrective trials that we deal with because we have been doing things wrong, and we got to get taken out behind back and cut a switch and wear us out, like to bring us back into this is what's happening here with Israel. And God does this again out of love, right? And we know we've had a couple of these examples now. I don't like busting Pippa's hind end, but I have to because I love her and I want to do the right things, right? And I want to correct her the things that she's doing wrong. Same thing here with God. He's doing this to Israel. We can see the correlation to us as well, that He will in fact do the same thing. Okay, so we're going to start in verse number 6 of chapter 2. We'll read the first 10 verses, and we're going to see an evaluation here of the first generation of these Israelites. Okay, that He is going to give them, let's introduce kind of the second narrative, the second prologue first, and then we're going to get this kind of this evaluation, what this first generation should have been doing. Okay, now, parents are usually good at giving advice, though. Well, Mom always said, right? Parents are usually good at giving advice, though the advice that they give sometimes is not always good. What is, or most of the time, the advice is good. just give me an example here. What's a piece of advice that you remember that your parents told you that you passed on to your kids, or that you've passed on to somebody younger than you? Do you have a good piece of advice that you remember that you pass on, that you have passed on? Anybody have an example of that? They can think real quick. I can give you one real quick. Any fish can float downstream. It takes somebody different to swim against the current, right? That's something Mom and Dad told me when I was smaller, and it stuck. Right? It stuck with me. And that's something that we are teaching our kids, right? You're Pippa, Moxie, your last name is Compton. That means that you need to be different than the rest of the world, right? It's easy for you to just go float. You decide to be different, and this is why. That's a piece of advice, right? I can give you some more. Like, what are some of the examples that you have? Do you all have any examples of good ones? No, you're not got any good advice.
Even a flea can eat an elephant if it takes small enough bites and comes back off.
There you go, right? Even a flea can eat an elephant. Right? How do you? No work, no play. Heard that one 1,000 times. That's a good one too, right? No work, no play. Anything else? I'm gonna write some of these down so I can use them. Nothing else? He who gets a ticket pays a ticket. That's a good one. That's a good one.
That's one of those Chinese ones.
Yeah, right. Choices, right? This is another one. I can give you. Dad's heard a lot of these, and we can probably echo the same sentiment here. Everybody's got choices, right? So choices make you. You got consequences for your choices. Good choices, bad choices. You make those choices, and you have to deal with consequences. And choices make who you are. So that's another one that we're trying to instill into little girls who are a little bit wild at times.
You don't always tell a kid, don't let your mouth fry the chicken.
That's a good. Yeah, there's a good one. That's absolutely. All right, what do you think motivated your parents, and what motivated you as parents to give you that piece of advice? What was the motivation of passing that on, or why do you think your parents passed that on to you? Love. Help you make better decisions, right? I didn't really grasp this until of course we've all go through this. I didn't really grasp this until I had my own kids. But the stuff that Mom and Dad, they were trying to keep me from screwing some stuff up, right? They were trying to help me get down. And at the time, I didn't see that. But now I've got my own kids, and I don't want them to make some of those mistakes, right? You kind of see, just kind of help make things a little bit easier, right? To help make better decisions and make better choices. How has the good advice of your parents influenced your life? Positively, right? I would hope positively, right? There's things that we wouldn't have been able to have these conversations about stuff or talk about these things and kind of giggle about these things if they hadn't had positive influences on us. God gave parents the role of instructing their children. He even made it a part of the law of Moses. And we'll see kind of as we look through chapter 2 here why God did that and why it is an important practice for us to follow today. Okay? The second prologue here presents the first of a couple generational problems that the Israelites have. And the problem starts when the parents neglected to be passionate about God and then neglected teaching those truths onto their children. Okay? Their children knew not God, and because of that developed sinful passions instead of godly passions, and then that's going to affect, right, that choice of this first generation parents essentially is going to essentially affect Israel throughout the rest of the book of Judges, okay, because of the decision or the lack of concern for this first generation, okay. Being passionate for God and then sharing that passion is kind of the main subject here as we go through these things. Okay, so the second prologue here of Judges parallels the first one that we read a couple of weeks ago. They both begin with a reference to the death of Joshua, and then include a reference to the failures of Israel as well. Okay, and then end up with a word of prophetic judgment if Israel doesn't do the things that they should. All right, so verses 1 through 5, let's start there and kind of give us some context here of this. And an angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I made you go up out of Egypt and have brought you unto the land which I swear unto your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And ye shall make no league with the inhabitants of this land. Ye shall throw down their altars, which ye have not obeyed my voice. Why have ye done this? Wherefore I also said, I will not drive them out from before you, but they shall be as thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare unto you. And it came to pass, when the angel of the Lord spake these words unto all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voice and wept. And they called the name of the place Bochim, and their sacrifice there unto the Lord. So we've got first 5 verses here gives us, again, the reference to some of the failures that are going on with Israel, some prophetic judgment that is there as well. It's going to be a thorn in your side. Their gods are going to be a problem unto you. And if you jump down to verse 20 of chapter 2 as well, we see that, and the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he said, because that this people hath transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and have not hearkened unto my voice, I will also not henceforth drive out any from before them of the nations which Joshua left when he died. All right, so we see the perspective here very similar to the first prologue. First prologue presents Israel's conquest attempts and talks about some of the effectiveness of those, and of course several tribes that were in the first prologue that fighting very specific enemies for the specific territories that we saw in chapter 1, and we see the success of the military towards the end of that prologue to the not so much of the success in putting the enemies under the tribute, right? We kind of talked about a couple of weeks ago. The second viewpoint, or the second prologue here, gives us not just a military and kind of total conquest of what they're doing, but gives us more of a moral standpoint of where the tribes of Israel are, okay? And more of a theological viewpoint than a military and conquest viewpoint, all right? It shows the disobedience of Israel to the Mosaic covenant. All right, and their defiance in coming up or understanding or gaining the knowledge of God, or having a lack of the knowledge of God. Go look at verse 9 of chapter 2. 9 and 10. And they buried him in the borders of the inheritance of Timnath-Heres on the Mount Ephraim on the north side of the hill of Gash. And also all that the generations were gathered unto their fathers. And there arose another generation after them, which what? What's it say? Knew not God, right? Knew not the Lord, nor yet the works which he had done for Israel. Okay? So we see them having a lack of the knowledge of the Lord and the work that he is doing. And it actually had gotten so bad that verse 11 tells us that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baal, right? And served Balaam here. So not only had they forsaken God, forgot about what has done for them, they are actually worshiping a whole nother God that they definitely have been told not to, specifically in the 10 Commandments, right? Keep going here. Look at verse 12. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, which brought them out of the lands of Egypt, and followed other gods. So we see, just in one generation, complete disdain, complete lack of care for what God had done for them. a total change in who they are serving, who they are worshiping a false god, going through all the things that go, pursuing other things. And then if you jump all the way down to verse 17, and yet they would not hearken unto their judges, but they went a-whoring after other gods, and bowed themselves unto them. They turned quickly out of the way which their fathers walked in, obeying the commandments of the Lord, but they did not so. We see a very quick decline here, right, of the morality and the spirituality of the Israelites. It just happened in one generation, okay? That's how quickly things can fall when parents aren't diligent in teaching the truths of God onto the next generation, right? If Haley and I don't do our job as Christian parents, letting Pippa and Moxie know about the truth, about God, what it means, they can fall away very quickly, right? And then it's going to take who knows how long, or if ever, to essentially get our family back to following the ways of the Lord. Okay? So there's great importance in the jobs of parents to make sure that those truths are being taught and passed on to their children. Now, God responds here, and we're going to see this multiple times, but God responds to Israel's defiance with anger, and not just any type of anger, but with a very righteous anger. All right, go to verse 14. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel, and he delivered them into the hands of the spoilers that spoiled them, and he sold them into the hands of their enemies round about, so they could not any longer stand with their enemies. Go down to verse number 20. And the anger of the Lord was hot against Israel. And he said, because that this people hath transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and hath not hearkened unto my voice. So God responds to their defiance with righteous anger, and he disciplines Israel in accordance with the curses for breaking the Mosaic covenant. Okay? Over in Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 28 and 29. Chapters 27 and 28, we see the curses that were there for breaking the covenant. Israel responds, right? Israel has a response to the trial, okay, or to the correction. The discipline that he is carrying out. They cry out to him for deliverance. Go to verse 16. Nevertheless, the Lord raised up judges, which delivered them out of the hands of those that spoiled them. Jump down to verse 18. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hands of their enemies all the days of the judge. For it repented the Lord because of their groanings by reason of them that oppressed them and vexed them. So they cry out during the discipline to God for deliverance, and then God raises up judges to deliver Israel. All right? In response to God raising up these judges to help deliver Israel, Israel indulges even further into their apostasy and into the depravity in which the way they are living. And we see that they played the harlot with other gods. Right? Verse 19 says that they played the harlot and chased after all of these other gods, would not cease from their sins, would not cease from their stubborn ways. So they were crying out to God for deliverance, not because of their faults, but because of the punishment of their faults, right? There's a big difference there. It's one thing to repent and realize why you're going through the corrective trial. Oh man, I really messed things up. I need to make sure I don't do that again. And you repent and move in a different direction. That was not the case here. They got in the fire, and the fire was hot, and they wanted God to throw some cold water on it. But they still wanted the fire to be there. Okay? Essentially, kind of what was going on here. And again, this is a vicious circle that we'll see several times throughout the book of Judges. The cycle repeats itself over and over and over again. The problem with the cycle is that the consequences of the sin keep getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. Okay? So there is a rebellion going on against God. We're going to see this sin cycle in Judges, in which you're going to see sin, and then servitude, and then some supplication, and then salvation, and then sin, and then servitude, supplication, salvation. It's going to go over and over and over and over and over again. So the second prologue here in chapter 2 essentially gives us a formal introduction of what the book of Judges is about. From chapter 3 all the way to the end of chapter 16. And this is the phrase that we're going to see. And we won't turn to all these different places. We're just going to see about. I'm going to read off this reference list to you. Verse 11, chapter 2. Verse 7, chapter 3. Chapter 3, verses 7 and 12. Chapter 4, verse 1. Chapter 6, verse 1. Chapter 10, verse 6. Chapter 13, verse 1. So it's going to happen a lot. This is what you're going to see. The children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. You're going to see that happen over and over and over again. Back up to chapter 2 and verse 6, and let's look again here at the evaluation. So this is the prologue, right? This is what's going to be happening. Now let's go in and look at the evaluation here of the first generation. They have a responsibility. God tells them their responsibility and then evaluates their job of fulfilling that responsibility. So, second prologue opens with Joshua's dismissal of the congregation to their inheritance. Verse number 6, chapter 2. And when Joshua had let the people go, the children of Israel went every man unto his inheritance to possess the land. So we talk about Joshua's dismissal of the congregation to go into their inheritance. It moves pretty quickly here as we get into verse number 7 to a characterization of Joshua and the other elders who were outliving him. Israel serves the Lord during the time of Joshua and his elders. Right? Verse 7. And the people served the Lord all of the days of Joshua and all of the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord that he did for Israel. So that first generation of people here that were with Joshua and lived longer than Joshua, they remember, the things that the Lord had done for them. While walking around in the wilderness, the crossing of the Red Sea, bringing the manna down, bringing the quail down, having the water come up places, all the different miracles and things that God, how they took, walking around 4 years and shoes never wearing out, all those things that took place. They remembered those things, recognized those things, and lived for the Lord essentially because of those, right? They had not forsaken what God had done for them. Joshua is buried here at 110 years old. So he died when he was 110 and was buried in his inheritance, which was in the Mount Ephraim. Verse number 8. And Joshua the son of Nun, serving the Lord, died being 110 years old, and they buried him in the borders of his inheritance in Timnath Heres, in the Mount of Ephraim, on the north side of the hill Gash. Okay, so that's where he was. He was an adult when he left Egypt. So he was in Egypt, was an adult when he left Egypt, and was able to fully understand all that God was doing. So he witnessed, first of all, the hardships while he was in Egypt. He walked through the Red Sea, which, as I was studying this, that for some reason that never registered with me. Like Joshua was there, he walked across the Red Sea. He was there. For some reason I kind of thought maybe he was not alive yet. I don't know what I thought. But I guess I didn't really realize that he was there for all those things. So he kind of saw the full capacity of the stuff that took place. He was there giving the law of Sinai, the failure to take the land, wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, and then eventually taking and settling the promised land as the leader of Israel. More importantly, Joshua was first-hand witness to God's revelation of himself to Israel. Okay? God captured his revelation of himself in the Pentateuch. His plan was for Israel to read that so they could glorify and obey him. And then each generation would be diligent in introducing the next generation to God by using the Pentateuch and using those scriptures and having those things to pass on to the future generations. The book of Deuteronomy, as a matter of fact, is emphatic, right, about the need for Israel to teach the next generation about God. Let's flip over there real quick and let me show you an example of that. Deuteronomy chapter 6, and go to verses 4 and 5, and we'll see the example of this here, how emphatic Deuteronomy is about teaching this and passing it on. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might. And these words which I command thee this day shall be in thine heart. Verse 7, and thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. So he encompasses every part of living there, right? That you should be teaching those things. The essential part of teaching and reaching the next generation was that the parents were to love God, heart, soul, and mind, with all of it. All right. So now, brings us to the generation entering the promised land. Was to have a heart for God. They were to love Him with all their being because God had in fact chose them to be His people. He delivered them from Egypt, brought them to the promised land. They were also to love God for who He was because over the course of their lives, right, God had revealed Himself. The old generation of those entering in the promised land were young people when they left Egypt. They saw what Joshua saw, and you go through Exodus, through Deuteronomy to remind us kind of all the different things that God's introduction of Himself to them. All the things that God had done. All right. So just as a reminder for us as well, and a reminder of the mindset of what this generation that was taking the promised land should have been. Okay, just quickly, I'm going to run through some things, and that's how we'll kind of finish up today's lesson. God began His introduction of Himself to Moses and Israel as the sovereign over all. Exodus chapter 1 and chapter 2 talks about that, right? He guides, directs Moses' life, grew Israel into a large nation despite Pharaoh's plans to diminish the strength of Israel and its number. God then directly met with Moses at the burning bush, right? Introduced Himself as the transcendent helper who is far above Moses and Israel, yet near to them and there to help them. Okay, I mean, we went through this as we went through our study of Exodus. He uses the name I am while talking to Moses, meaning that He is eternal. He is self-existent. God then addressed Israel in Egypt, coming to them as Yahweh, right? Which the promise keeper. Okay. After sending 9 plagues on Egypt, God revealed Himself to Israel as their redeemer in providing lambs and the blood that they put over their doorposts to protect during the Passover. While the 10th plague was going on, He acted as their leader by wisely taking them and powerfully taking them through the Red Sea. He acted as their and revealed that He was their provider, right? By giving them water to drink, meat to eat, and making their way to Mount Sinai. At Mount Sinai, He reveals Himself to Israel as being their instructor, right? Gives them the 10 Commandments, the beginning of the law, the stipulations of the Mosaic covenant, and the benefits of enjoying the benefits of being obedient to that covenant as well. Also at Sinai, God revealed that He is glorious, right? He is the glorious God when He showed justice and mercy to Aaron and the people who were worshiping the calf on the bottom of the mountain while Moses was getting the 10 Commandments. He gave directions for sacrifices, gave them the priesthood, showed that He was the atoner in Exodus 35 through chapter 35 through 40, and in Leviticus as well, setting up the priesthood and how they would have an atonement for their sins. Between Sinai and the Promised Land, God demonstrated Himself as the gracious giver. First 13 or 14 chapters of Numbers. He blessed the undeserving, ungrateful, and unbelieving Israel. And after Israel refused to enter the Promised Land, God revealed Himself as the powerful proclaimer whose words cannot be stopped at the last chapters in Numbers. So 40 years then passed as Israel wandered the wilderness, and once the rebellious generation that wouldn't go into the Promised Land was dead, God speaks to the next generation and restated His law and presents Himself in Deuteronomy as the loving Lord. Moses' last address to the next generation of Israel, he portrays God as the solid rock because of his unwavering, faithful character throughout Israel's history. And it's God's faithfulness that Moses wants the Israelites to acknowledge. And the faithfulness as a solid rock was to form the backdrop to the conquest and the eventual life in the Promised Land. So as Deuteronomy kind of finishes up, and we move into the things going on here in Judges moving forward as they're taking over the Promised Land, we see God is solidly faithful, He's true, He's just, He's righteous. He has perfectly orchestrated this revelation of Himself to these people, right? These people have been intimately having a knowledge of God. He has showed them a whole host of character traits on why He wants them to be the people and why He can help them and make sure that they have the things that they need. They know Him, they've understood Him, and they've seen Him now. Okay? Multiple times. This has happened a bunch of times. Provided Israel with all they would need to know and then established the Promised Land. God then tells them to teach the next generation, the ones going into the Promised Land. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 20, and we'll finish there. Go to verse 20 of Deuteronomy chapter 6 because we're still there. He tells them some specific instructions on what would happen if the parents teach the children the commandments. Right? If you do these things, if you are faithful to me and teach the next generation, this is what's going to happen. And when thy son asketh thee in time to come, saying, what mean the testimonies and statutes and judgment which the Lord our God hath commanded you? Thou shalt say unto thy son, we were Pharaoh's bondmen in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. And the Lord showed signs and wonders great and sore upon Egypt, upon Pharaoh, and upon all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from thence, that he might bring us in, and to give us the land which he sware unto our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that he might preserve us alive as it is this day. And it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before the Lord our God as he hath commanded us. So God tells them in Deuteronomy, parents teach the children God's commands, and this would happen. They would provide an opportunity for the parents to teach their children about God and His promises concerning the Mosaic covenant. So you continue to pass this down to generation to generation to generation. God continues to bless generation to generation to generation. Okay, that should have been what took place, right? The book of Judges, in an alternate timeline, should have been nothing but conquest of the people of Israel taking over the Promised Land and then setting up, their territory and their kingdom essentially as God had promised to provide them. But because of the fault of the parents, right? Because of the fault of just one generation, knowing what they should have done because they were taught, and then not doing it, or not doing it adequately, or not all of them, whatever the case, whatever it was that happened, just in one generation, we see a dramatic decline, not just of their numbers, because a lot of them die, but a moral and spiritual decline that happens. They fall so far that God has to do some really drastic things just to get them to even kind of notice that He still wants them. Okay? That is why there's such great importance for parents, grandparents, so on and so forth, right? That we are teaching the next generation the truths about God. I've heard Uncle Tim say this a lot of times, and I'll finish with this, right? Got a family, come to church, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday, right? Something happens, and then they don't quit coming on Wednesday, and then one or two generations, they're not coming on Sunday nights, then the next, they're not coming at all. And then they've lost complete understanding of the importance of being in church at all, right? I've heard him say that, and we have seen, you all have instances, you can know families and people that has happened to. It's the same thing here in the teaching of these truths, right? Mom and Dad taught Chad and I these truths because they got it from their mom and dad, and Mom got it from her mom. And if Haley and I don't do this to our girls, and Chad and Tia aren't doing this to the boys, we're going to see their kids probably have no concept of God at all. Right? And I don't want a position to where my grandkids don't know church or God or anything at all, right? So there's great importance there that is being passed on to the next generation. We see it in Israel. We see the decline of it, which is a warning sign for us as the reader, right? Make sure that you're doing these things. This is what had to happen to the Israelites just to get them to sort of focus on God a little bit, right? It is a red flag, a beacon in the night. It's a warning sign to us. To me as a parent, right, to make sure that is being passed on to the next generation. How quickly they can fall. And none of us want to see that or have to experience that or be around that in any way. So as we look through this, and we're going to see the judging and all these other things kind of taking place, we're going to see this, and you're probably going to hear me say this a lot because I'm in the middle of this right now, right? I mean, some of you all have older kids. I'm in the middle of this right now. I got to make sure that the girls know so they can pass that on to the next generation. Okay, that's the great importance thing that we're going to see, and because we see the consequences of it when it's not. All right. So that brings us to first prologue, the responsibility of this first generation. Unfortunately, we're going to jump into chapter 2, verse 10, see the failure of that generation, the neglect, and then essentially the fall that happens because of it. All right, and that's what we'll move into through chapter 2 next week. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the opportunity that we have here to be able to see how we should be conducting ourselves, Lord, as Christians, how we should be conducting ourselves as parents, as not just parents to kids, but we got a ton of kids moving in here on Wednesday nights for Awanas. That's part of this as well. We should be teaching them the same thing so that they can understand and see the importance of that as well. It's a warning sign for parents of kids. It's also a warning sign for us as a church as we are ministering to the next generation, that they are also seeing the importance of living a life following after you and then the consequences of not doing that. It's a total team effort that we should have great concern and care for, so that we can see the fruition of those promises in the lives of kids and grandkids, and then the other kids and grandkids that we're ministering to here on Wednesdays as well, Lord. So I pray it's a beacon, a warning call to us, a wake-up call to us, a reinforcement for us, Lord, of the importance of passing on the lessons and truths you have for us, Lord, as well. I pray for Pastor Rob as he comes here in the next little bit, Lord, that you use him in a mighty way to keep us attentive to the word that you have for us to him this morning as well. And now I pray.